It's the week ending Saturday, the 3rd of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen a bomb attack in Kabul killing over 80 people. We've seen Ariana Grande announcing a benefit concert for the people of Manchester, and we've seen Jeremy Corbyn make a surprise appearance at the BBC's election debate. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And with me today from the week's digital team are Holden, Frith, Anna Dubuis and Arion McNicoll. And to start the show with his top pick of the week, it's Holden. What have you brought with you?
Well, as if one election wasn't enough, I want us all to take a moment and a deep breath and think about the next one.
This is about reducing the number of Labour MPs at the next general election. But more importantly than that, we're proceeding with a boundary redistribution where something in the region of 2 million people have not been counted in these numbers. Because ahead of the Brexit referendum, 2 million people got themselves onto the register. And they're not being part of the count that is being used to draw up these new boundaries. So people are disenfranchised, and if Lord Hayward was correct about this is all being very reasonable, why on earth is he proceeding with cutting, or why is his party proceeding with cutting the numbers of MPs by 50?
Labour's John Ashworth there, speaking on Sky News about proposed boundary changes. Now, Holden, these changes are part of the Conservative manifesto, but actually no one in the mainstream media has been discussing them so far. In fact, that clip was from last September, but they are there. They're in the manifesto. So you think we should be talking about this now?
I think we should, and although they're not going to affect this election, they almost certainly will have a significant effect on the next election. The changes to boundaries will mean that Labour will lose probably something like 25 seats, the Conservatives will lose 10. One of the Labour victims will be Jeremy Corbyn, whose Islington North seat will disappear from the electoral map.
And that'll be because it will just be Islington, will it, as opposed to North and South?
That's right. So there's lots of rejigging to try to equalise the number of registered voters, give or take, in each constituency. They've got quite out of kilter. At the top end of the scale, you have the Isle of Wight, which has 105,000 registered voters. And at the bottom end, you have Nahelanan and Iar, otherwise known as the Western Isles, which has just 20,000 voters, so a fifth of the total number of the Isle of Wight. There's sort of mainland examples too. So Manchester Central has 87,000 voters, whereas some of the Welsh constituencies have less than 30,000.
OK, so before we get into the fact that this does benefit the Conservatives over Labour and why that is, and of course it's no surprise to see the Tories putting it on their manifesto, therefore, let's just deal with that issue of fairness, though. Is it fair that you have, vastly disproportionate amounts of voters per seat? And isn't it fair that they try and reduce the amount of MPs in the House of Commons? There are 650.
So I think the total number is not really related to fairness. That proposal actually came out of the expenses scandal, which broke 8 years ago this week. And this is one of the slightly tangential reforms that was proposed after that, essentially to save money as far as I can see, but it seems a fairly trivial amount of money in the kind of grand scheme of things. To address the more substantial point of whether equalising the number of voters will make things fairer, I think it probably will within the first past the post system. So the result will better reflect the intentions of a greater number of voters, but it certainly won't be anything like a proportional system.
And now let's talk about the fact that it does benefit the Tories. So the reason, as I understand it, that it benefits the Tories is because if you make the areas bigger, then cities become cities plus suburbs, and suburban voters are likely to be more affluent and more likely to vote Conservative. So seats that are currently Labour inner city seats are more likely to be Conservative in the future.
I think there's a sort of a range of different factors that explain this, but it's essentially population movement. And over time, Labour seats have seen a reduction in their population, which means Labour actually have an advantage under the current system. So although the change will benefit the Conservatives, it's not that it's tilting the system in their favour, it's reducing an unjust imbalance in Labour's favour under the current system.
So Stephen Kinnock calls it barefaced gerrymandering. His seat is also one of the seats that happens to be at risk, so it's certainly in his interest to maybe make this point. But what do you think about the fact that the Tory manifesto also has another couple of proposals in it that seems to benefit the Conservatives as well, including requiring voters to have ID documents when they go to voting booths and also offering British expatriates votes for life? The idea being that people who live overseas, this is a bit unproven, but people who live overseas tend to vote a bit more conservative than they do Labour.
Yes, I think they're trying to get the system that most benefits them, and I think Labour would do the same if it was within their control. I have mixed feelings about requiring ID. I have no real feelings about overseas expats voting. I think the argument that we ought to maintain a system that is unfair in order to level the playing field because Labour is behind in the polls at the moment doesn't really hold water as an argument. I think there is a broader question of whether first past the post is the fairest system, but it's almost set up without fairness as its goal. It's meant to produce majorities, it's meant to produce decisive governments. I can see the merit in that.
Anna, do you think the public have actually been consulted about this in a sense? Because as Holden points out, yes, it's in the manifesto, but it's not being discussed. So swing voters, perhaps former Labour or Lib Dem voters who don't feel confident about voting for those parties this time round, might be voting for the Tories on the basis of Brexit or on the basis of the economy or on the basis of leadership and not realise that they're actually potentially freezing out their former party in the future of getting their seat.
Well, in the past, communities have been consulted. And it's one aspect that isn't really in this debate. It's like most of the chatter is about whether it's gerrymandering, but the actual impact on local areas, it sometimes makes the headlines. But one area in particular where this issue is really become quite fraught is down in Cornwall, where they want to create a new border between Devon and Cornwall. It's called Devon Wall. And people are furious down there, because for them it's a historic boundary. When you go from one town to the next, from Cornwall into Devon, they're proud of that distinction. I don't think maybe when you live in a London constituency that isn't so culturally significant, I don't think we can really appreciate that. But people down in Cornwall and Devon are really passionate about this, and a few years ago, they campaigned strongly against the boundary changing. There was a big campaign that was set up, and they decided they would plan to blockade the roads between the two constituencies. And this actually goes back to the idea of Devon Wall, goes back to the 1970s. It was a political concept introduced by the Tories to link Cornwall and Devon into one political and cultural area. And that also faced huge opposition.
It's hard to know how you could do it better, really, given the fact that people do move around the country, and ultimately some places are going to shrink in terms of their populations, others are going to expand, and so the alternative is having places that are massively overrepresented in terms of the number of votes contributing to the election of a particular official, and places that are then simultaneously being underrepresented. So I don't know quite what you could do.
Part of the problem here is that it's been such a long time since the last boundary change. So it's meant to happen on a fairly regular basis. But the last batch were cancelled, and then this snap general election has forced another delay. In theory, if it happens more often, it will be tweaks around the edges of existing constituencies rather than this wholesale redrawing of the map.
And famously, turkeys are somewhat reluctant to vote for Christmas. Is it going to go to the House of Commons and then everyone gets a say on it anyway? Because then even if it is in the Conservative manifesto, this could be watered down, couldn't it?
When the proposals first came to light in the last Parliament, David Cameron was very quick to assure all sitting MPs that they would be found a new seat. Labour has a similar approach, which is that anyone whose existing constituency covers 40% of a new constituency has an automatic claim to that new constituency. This actually doesn't help Corbyn because Emily Thornberry and Diane Abbott, his two neighbours, can stake a claim to the resulting constituency. So he'll have to be found a new constituency somewhere else.
Yeah. And you talk about Devon and Cornwall, Anna. Seriously, the turf warfare between Islington North and Islington South. People are very proud to come from one side or other of the town.
That's true. Yeah.
But this is a real challenge, I think, for the Boundary Commission. Their sort of terms of reference are they have to reduce the number to 600 MPs. They have to aim for a total number of registered voters of between something like 71 and 78,000 people. And then as a secondary aim, they have to respect geographical and historical boundaries. So that means they're looking at kind of electoral wards and rivers and county boundaries and all of these quite difficult to define factors, and then sort of nailing down these numbers at the same time.
The nature of my question when I said, will this get watered down, is it seems to me that there's often promises that radical things will happen in the terms of the way that our politics is done. We did have an alternative vote referendum, but it was roundly thrashed by the public. There was some sort of House of Lords review, wasn't there? But the House of Lords, as far as I can see, remains the same, even though hereditary peers were phased out.
That's actually why we're still talking about this, or still not talking about this now. It was part of the coalition deal was meant to be boundary changes for the Conservatives in return for the Lib Dems' idea to reform the House of Lords.
Right.
When Cameron backtracked on Lords reform, Nick Clegg nixed the boundary redrawing.
But one final thing on this before you all drift off to sleep. There is this issue now as well of, in the Conservative manifesto, it says first past the post will be implemented not just on these MP elections, but also on mayoral elections and police commissioner elections. Now, no one's asked for that.
Well, nobody votes in the police commissioner election anyway, so...
Well, that doesn't mean that we should just
make
the system less democratic. When people look at the mayoral election, generally, it seems to me, this is one of the things in favour of the alternative vote, wasn't it? Was people were saying, well, why are you so opposed to it? Because it works very well for the mayoral election. And now they're saying, no, it doesn't, we want to change it. Why?
It does seem a backward step, and I like the AV vote for the mayoral election. I think for Mayor of London, I think that it does mean you can have a genuine choice of who you want, and then you have your backup option. I also, in the AV referendum, I did vote to introduce AV, although I'm not as much of a fan of that now. I think perhaps the place to introduce proportional voting on a national scale might be a reformed House of Lords, just to link those two great democratic questions.
Yeah, and to get a bit parochial about it, Australia has exactly that system where the lower house...
You're not killing the Queen, Arion.
Yeah.
That's sacrosanct.
We'll get to that later.
We're all agree.
Yeah. But no, the lower house has first past the post, and the upper house, which is our equivalent of the Lords, has proportional representation. So you've actually got both systems and a good sort of sense of check and balance. Seems like a potential win there, given that the Lords is pretty anachronistic.
Next up, it's Anna. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Today, I'm asking, has the environment been well and truly trumped?
For I believe, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., that there is such a thing as being too late. And when it comes to climate change, that hour is almost upon us. But if we act here, if we act now, if we place our own short-term interests behind the air that our young people will breathe and the food that they will eat and the water that they will drink and the hopes and dreams that sustain their lives, then we won't be too late for them.
That's what presidents used to sound like. Barack Obama there, speaking in November 2015 at the COP21 climate change meeting in Paris. Okay, Anna, at the time of recording, but possibly not the time of listening, President Trump has yet to announce his policy on climate change, but it's been widely leaked that he is going to pull America out of the Paris Agreement. That seems to be the way it's heading. Even his tweet, "Let's make America great again" today, relating to this, clearly suggests that he's going the way that he campaigned on this, which was to pull America out of the Paris Agreement. However, it is big news. It is making the headlines. So why have you chosen it as the story that might have greater significance than it's otherwise attracting?
Well, the Paris Agreement was for the first ever legally binding deal globally that countries would sign up to agree to greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation. It was said to be, it was an historic deal that almost every nation on the planet committed to. And
who were the two that didn't? Syria
and Nicaragua.
Nicaragua
apparently said that the deal was not strong enough.
Yeah, and Syria presumably just had other stuff going on.
They're busy,
Yeah.
Right. We have these stories about climate change. You have scientists telling us figures about how much the world's going to get hotter by X many degrees. It's going to affect different countries around the world. And it feels like in 2017, we're not really getting anywhere.
Yes, from that perspective, America pulling out would be a massive backward step. But when you say we haven't got anywhere, you've just said every other nation in the world pretty much does agree. So even without America, there is a worldwide consensus. It's just that, they're a pretty big polluter.
There is a consensus, but you would have hoped that something like the Paris Agreement would have come years previously, because we've been warned about this for decades.
The Paris Accord is a pretty loose agreement in any case. So even though that many countries got in the same room at the same time, the agreement itself is fairly limited. Each country gets to set its own parameters for what it views as success, and then they get to grade one another in this sort of notionally mutually responsible way. But I think the problem is, as an agreement, it only serves to hold the world to a certain level of temperature rise in any case, and that's not ambitious enough. So the US
That's
pulling
not why
out...
Trump's pulling out, is it? Trump's not pulling out because he's not ambitious enough.
No.
He's not the kind of guy that says, you know what, there's not enough nuance here.
No, quite.
He's pulling out because it's cheaper, isn't it, domestically, to keep making... And, he's trying to restore jobs to America.
And he believes in coal.
Yes.
So, no, absolutely. And he also doesn't really believe in climate change itself. So no, there's many reasons why he's against it.
Do we think that's true, that he doesn't believe in climate change? Because he previously did back the Democrats, didn't he? And although in this election he has talked about climate change being a hoax and da-da-da, I wonder with Trump, you kind of have to take it all with a pinch of salt. Was that really just anti-Chinese, pro-American rhetoric? And he didn't really mean climate change doesn't exist. He means there's an element to which it's been politicised. And those two things aren't mutually exclusive. It has been politicised, and the consensus is catastrophic if we don't do something.
It's really hard to work out what's going on in Trump's mind at any one moment. According to all of the reports from the very leaky White House, there have been huge debates within his team about whether he would withdraw or commit to the Paris Agreement. And it seems that it genuinely could have gone either way. And it's just that the Steve Bannon nationalist wing of the administration has won out over the more globalist sort of reform-minded wing of Rex Tillerson and Ivanka Trump. But I think this may actually be the best possible thing for the Paris Agreement because, as both of you have suggested, it is quite a flawed document and it isn't particularly binding in the goals it sets. But because Trump has come out against it, and because anything Trump comes out against instantly has massive international support, it's probably going to redouble everybody else's efforts.
Yes, and already China and Germany have come out and said very firm things about their own commitment to the agreement and how they're going to redouble their efforts. I totally agree.
What about Americans, though? I mean, Anna, this is going to create, isn't it, within the USA, a backlash? Is it only going to be people who hate Trump anyway?
No, I mean, there was a study that 60 or so % of Americans wanted to stay within the Paris Agreement. And there have been protests. I think it would be a backlash because of Trump. But on a personal level, as in the individual, I wonder whether the environment and climate change is on people's priority list right now. You look at the UK, the manifestos of all the political parties, obviously the Green Party, environmental policies are up there.
Well, that's a good point. They're up there, but they're not paramount, actually, are they? Even the Green Party aren't really pushing green policies.
Back when David Cameron said the Tories were going to be the greenest Conservative Party ever.
Before the banking crash.
But then after that, I mean, environmental policies never make the headlines. They're there hidden in manifestos, but it's not a priority. And I wonder what it is about climate change. Well, you have The Guardian who write everything about climate change. But why does it not resonate? Is it because it's too big a global problem? Is it?
I think it is too big a problem to grasp. It's similar in some ways to the pension issue we were talking about a few weeks ago, perhaps social care, where it may be at the back of people's minds. Some people would prefer not to think about it at all.
I read a study about the idea of risk perception as it relates to climate change. And one of the great problems is that even the term itself, global warming, sounds quite pleasant, and people are just not able to take in the real threat that it presents in the same way that they do, say, sharks and spiders, which have a real sort of visceral, personal impact on one's psyche. But the idea of mass droughts over a long period of time and failing crops and rising sea levels and movement of people, it's really hard to hold in your brain.
It's very easy to think of it as somebody else's problem as well, and that anything you can do about it is too small. And again, I wonder whether attaching Trump to the idea of climate change denial gives us a villain, gives people something to kind of latch onto in a way that it's previously been too difficult to really grapple with in that way.
Also, by voicing those climate deniers, I mean, there's a smidgen of doubt. So when people are asking, why should I bother about this, when there aren't really many incentives, especially financial incentives, when you've got a smidgen of doubt, it's kind of like, wow.
I mean, well, let's talk about those financial incentives, because that's it, isn't it? For the ordinary voters, it's a feeling that, yes, I'd like to do the right thing by the country so that, my great-grandchildren don't drown in the sea. But what can I do on a daily basis myself? And actually, sometimes those solutions aren't that obvious. And it's interesting you mentioned The Guardian. if you live in a flat and you cycle everywhere in a city, then actually you are more likely to be a bit more green conscious because it's a bit easier for you, isn't it? If you live out in the sticks and you've got to drive and take planes and, energy is expensive, what can you do? People are looking for things they can do.
Purchasing solar panels. That's not advertised. There's no incentive, energy efficient heating, cars, insulating homes, those type of things, which I guess people think that they're available, but how do you access them?
And a lot of those involve an upfront cost as well, so you have to put money in even if you'll get it back.
Well,
in the long
government
run.
has to put money in. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah,
but I think really.
But that's where the personal responsibility comes back in. That people need to put it back on their own voting agenda, for example, put it back in the public realm where it's being spoken about. And so, actually. That's where it needs to be the relationship between the individual and the national that's going to make a difference.
I think though is what will eventually solve it, if anything does, is probably economics rather than politics, or at least a heavy blend of the two. So once renewable energy is cheaper than gas and coal, which it will be sooner or later, and it's accelerating all the time, then China will switch en masse to solar and wind.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? In a curious way, Trump insisting that more gets made in the USA and people aren't getting their iPods made in China might actually help climate change, mightn't it? If we're not shipping stuff over and they're not emitting so many fumes.
At the moment, every time Trump seems to do anything, it has the opposite effect. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if he ends up solving climate change by accident.
And finally, Arion, what do you think this past 7 days will be remembered for?
So this clip is about an album that was released 50 years ago today that apparently keeps getting better all the time.
So this is the original stereo mix of Sgt. Pepper, and this is actually the remaster that came out. And it's iconic, it's great, but there's almost a veil in front of the band and the listener. So the new mix, what we're doing actually, we're taking off layers.
By going back a generation.
So suddenly you have this.
Giles Martin, son of Sir George, talking to NPR's Bob Boylan. So, Arion, it's been 50 years since the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper. You're not going to say this hasn't been covered. I've been very aware of this.
It sure has been covered, and yes, it's coincided with this re-release that they're discussing of the album itself that's been digitally remastered, had a bunch of tracks added to it.
You're going to tell us it's even more significant than we possibly could have imagined.
What I think is that it's more significant than perhaps the public reaction has been. I think you and I, and well, many people may be aware that this is going on, but at the same time there seems a sort of certain apathy about the reaction to it. Even the album itself is currently sitting at about, well, it's in the 80s. I think it's currently 84 on the charts. So there hasn't been this sort of massive reaction. Compare that to the anthology album that was released in the mid-90s that went straight to number one, was platinum. You know, there's just been a very muted response, and I'm sort of curious about why that is and whether there is a kind of dimming of Beatlemania that's going on.
Excellent. Okay, I'm glad we're talking about whether the Beatles are past it rather than whether Sgt. Pepper is getting the attention it deserves. Okay, are the Beatles past it, Anna?
I think the Beatles are set in their time. Our society is very different to the Summer of Love, and you listen to the music and it does sound of its day. So for younger generations that weren't brought up with, either were around when the Beatles were a big thing or were brought up with the Beatles through their parents listening to it, for those generations that don't have that connection, I feel like it's probably something they listen to, but not something that they would engage with.
I read an article that was addressing the very question of whether the Beatles are past it. And it was looking at the fact that you had that 90s era of Beatles interest in the likes of Blur and Oasis, who are kind of aping the format, the writing style, the musical style of the Beatles. But in the kind of Beyonce, Kanye West era, you're looking much further back into the past, and already people of the current generation of pop stars, they're looking back to people like Michael Jackson, your Madonna. They've got a whole different frame of reference for who their musical heroes are.
Well, sort of. I was listening for my sins to the Harry Styles album on the way here just to see what it was like. And that sounds, if anything, like a Kinks album. I mean, it's clearly influenced by 60s stuff. And I don't think it ever goes away. And, you know, there are a lot of young girls that like Harry Styles.
For sure. And actually, I haven't heard that album, but I hear that he's doing something that's comparatively experimental and trying to not just do the Robbie Williams take that usual act and try to pitch himself as an actual musician. So yeah, it still definitely has significance, but I just wonder whether it has the same resonance as it did, say, on even its 40th anniversary, where Sgt. Pepper was really recalled and there were all these TV specials, and it just seems like this time people don't care so much.
As Anna said, we sort of moved a couple of generations away. There's a bit of a dipping of interest, and then in 20 years' time they'll be rediscovered, almost like an example of a classic that will be kind of dusted off, and they'll take their place in the pantheon of, you know, Beethoven and Tchaikovsky and Lennon and McCartney.
Sgt. Pepper is a great album, ahead of its time. You know, Sir George Martin did incredible things mixing it, and it was very experimental and art rock and all the rest of it. It's not got most people's favourite Beatles tunes on it.
Because I came to know Beatles songs as almost an undifferentiated mass, and then gradually came to realise, okay, this is an early one, this is late, this is how they fit together. But I never really listened to them as albums. But then looking at Sgt. Pepper, it's a really weird bunch of songs. You know, clearly there's this sort of concept behind it of the Edwardian band Sgt. Pepper that's being brought back together, but then they can't quite pull that off, and actually some of the better songs on the track don't really seem to fit at all, like A Day in the Life, which is just thrown in at the end and certainly doesn't feel like it was.
Hold on a minute. I'm interested in this discussion. I'm not going to allow that to go out. A Day in the Life is not thrown in at the end, Holden.
A Day in the Life is such a remarkable song, and it is still fresh and quite startling, particularly the end of it. And it does cut through all of those cultural associations and allows you just to appreciate the music for what it is.
But when it comes to celebrating 50 years of any pop album, I mean, there aren't that many that are going to stand the test of time like Sgt. Pepper has, you know, even if it's diminished ever so slightly. I mean, what in our lifetimes is going to be looked at in, 30, 40 years' time and get the kind of admiration and coverage that Sgt. Pepper has?
It's always going to be hard to say, of course, isn't it? Because even at the time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came out to very mediocre reviews, in fact. So, you know, the albums that we may be looking back to from the present era may have flown a little bit under the radar. But I'd say things like Beyonce's Lemonade or Frank Ocean Blonde from the last year, they'd be contenders. Looking a bit further back, you've got Radiohead's OK Computer, obviously often named as one of the best albums of all time. Those sorts of albums are surely going to continue to resonate, and they're the ones that have that sense of ambition about them. And even something like, you know, looking at the way that Sgt. Pepper holds together as a body of work, I think that's common to all of those great albums. So maybe that's one of the things that's going to be looked back at too. Since
there's been a kind of resurgence in albums, especially with Beyonce, Kendrick Lamar, it is much more of a story arc. They're the albums that are remembered. Like if I think back on albums that have made an impact over the last 2 decades, say, sadly, the ones that spring to mind are the ones when I was much younger that I wouldn't want to say right now.
Oh, go on.
No.
Aqua.
I'm not going... No, God, no.
Ace of Base.
In the last, say, 12 years or so, I've been the one that makes my own albums because I used iTunes. And so it's those albums that actually, the artists that are preoccupied with how that album works as a piece of art rather than just, you know, checking them all together.
Series of songs. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Holden, any nominations for the album that's defined you?
I wouldn't go so far to say it defined me, but I would also go back to my teens, actually, and with a little bit of embarrassment say it probably was one of the Oasis albums that definitely maybe it came out when I think I was 16. Mm-hmm. Comparing Oasis to the Beatles just seems wrong on many levels, although they were desperately seeking that comparison. But I think it does have a lot to do with how old you are and at what stage of life you are when you hear those songs. And so I think it is natural that now that we're several generations on from the Beatles, people aren't making that connection in quite the same way.
Come on, Ollie, complete the loop. What were your albums?
I think I'd go Automatic for the People. Thanks for asking.
Yep.
Right, that is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. I think this will be a classic edition, look back on in 50 years' time. My thanks to Arion, McNicoll, Anna Dubuis, and the boss man, Holden Frith. For more from The Week, why not visit theweek.co.uk, download our free iPhone app, The Weekday, or get the magazine direct to your door. Just head to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. And you can subscribe to this podcast on all podcast apps. Just search for The Week Unwrapped. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week's election results. Bye-bye.